Well, hey there team, welcome back to the channel and welcome to Worth Your Time, Worth Your Money, an ongoing segment I run here where I look at the opening hours of new and upcoming games. And today we're looking at Escape From Duckov. So I'm a little bit late to the party. This came out a couple of weeks ago, but I found myself, honestly, I was picking up at Arc Raiders and I had a bit of extra splash around money in my wallet left. So I thought, yeah, why not? Let's give this a go. I think it had a bit of a launch discount, but even currently now, it's still going for like 25 bucks or something. It's cheap as anything. It's got overwhelmingly positive reviews, and you know, I understand why for sure. This is a really cool solo extraction game with its own quirky layer of humor, which is distinctly Asian, I suppose you could say. It's all duck themed, it's all very cutesy, a lot of that aesthetic is there. However, under the hood, the moving parts, it's a very solid game, and I would argue probably the strongest on-ramp for an extraction shooter on the market, just full stop, especially for people that look at the current landscape of extraction shooters and they're put off by it. And like I said, I mentioned Arc Raiders. Arc Raiders is out now, and actually as each day goes by it gets sweatier. I do like that game, I do, and without getting on too much of a tangent, one of the biggest tragedies for me personally as a normie, I may be a YouTuber, but I don't consider myself some sort of sweaty streamer type person that's trying to push themselves and perform and make myself known for my gameplay aptitude. I'm just a boring old casual gamer. But I feel like the extraction shooter space has been fairly aggressively hijacked by that sweaty PvP streamer or aspiring streamer attitude. And while Arc Raiders, while we're on our tangent, is a great example of doing something to try and combat that, it's a very PvE aggressive heavy game. The robots in there are not to be trifled with. They will smash your head in, and that kind of discourages a lot of PvP, or rather it really punishes aggressive PvP play. I suppose my point roundly is, when Duckov came onto the scene and pioneered this genre, a lot of people that were early adopters, myself included, before the streamer race, were interested in the spirit of a hardcore full loot, mostly PvE experience with a spattering of PvP as let's say like icing on the cake. And then, you know, not to go circular, the space changed, streamers kind of took it and ran with it, and the developers developed along that path, and that's where we are today. So yeah, we're getting a few attempts through things like Arc Raiders to bring it back to what I would argue are the roots of an extraction shooter, but you also have these single player type ones, and the most high profile are this at the moment and Zero Seavert. If you've never seen that, check that out. That is very much like Duckov. Well, I guess Duckov's like that. Seavert came first. However, that really does stick to the Russian militaristic, even stalker vibe that you see in the roots of something like Duckov. If Zero Seavert is downstream of Duckov and wearing its influences on its sleeve, Duckov is another step removed. It's a little bit more, like I said, cheeky, the humor, etc. However, it's still a solid game. We don't want to get away from that. While you play as a cute little duckling and the enemies bark, duck quacks when they see you, it still can get quite intense, quite full on depending on how hard you've pushed yourself and what zone you find yourself in. And having said all of that, it's actually much more forgiving by design. Every time you spawn into a run, like you leave your little shelter to do a run, there's a loot box at the beginning with a pretty solid basic pistol and a stack of ammo. That's your scav run equivalent that you get in these kind of games, because they're all aware. There is a self-awareness to the development of these games that someone might have 3-4 bad runs chained in a row. What happens then when you've just been beaten into the ground and lost all your loot? You need an olive branch, and so this one is just simply that. There's a loot box with some basics to get you going at the beginning of every raid. You can run back and you can actually loot your own body as well. Kind of Souls-like, I suppose. So if you do die and you lose all your stuff, it's there at least for one life. I haven't died twice in a row, so I kind of assume that if you died again going for that loot, loot, it would delete the previous loot, so you didn't end up with a stack of bodies. But I could be wrong, you never know. Like I said, this game's a lot more gentle than most. Obviously, it's getting a lot of uptick, and like I said, it has its Asian roots. It is interesting watching the sort of Asian uptake in the development scene. A lot of people are embracing it, myself included. I like to see what is a new culture, ultimately Chinese, entering the fray, right? I shouldn't necessarily generalize as Asian because Japan's been obviously at the table for decades now, and they bring their own isms to humor, gameplay, etc. And it is fun to see like another high profile culture basically just step in from the shadows. However, the one caveat, I suppose, it's difficult to pass out the numbers, right? So this is overwhelmingly positive and getting smashed with reviews. And I actually think, honestly, there is a much more positive review culture coming out of China as a sort of aside, but on the back of these sort of games. It's like I said, it's difficult to do anything other than speculate, but generally speaking, when one of these good games comes out from their part of the world, it usually comes with a huge influx of very positive reviews. I'm not saying this is botting or anything like that. Maybe it is. Maybe there's a kernel of that in there, but there's also a kernel of the fact that this is a really good game. It deserves the positive reviews. So maybe it's boosted a bit, and maybe it has a bit of cultural zeitgeist behind it, as you've seen with many other games that get kind of disproportionately supported in the review space when coming out of China, like Black Myth Wukong and that sort of stuff. Again, to be clear, I'm not saying they don't deserve that kind of appreciation, but as a contrast, you know, in the West, you see people race out to slam games with negative reviews 1 minute into their release. You see it all the time because there's this, they want to farm clown awards and stuff like that negatively on Steam. Anyway, again, I've discussed some peripheral stuff about the space, the culture, all that sort of stuff, but it's all part of the package, and I find it interesting to talk about. As far as the roots of the gameplay and what's going on here, it is very much like Zero Sievert. So if you've played that, in many ways you've played this. However, yes, this is much more gentle, and if you haven't played any of them, what it is ultimately a top-down, single-player only extraction shooter type game. So you're not going to get trolled or bullied or sweated on by hardcore PvPers that are desperately trying to boost their view count by going viral, doing some sort of shenanigan flick shot or whatever. I, generally speaking, just don't enjoy that space and that culture. I stay away from it. The actual sort of moving parts have what I would call the negatives of what Tarkov set out. Like, there is a difference, and probably a whole video's worth of discussion that we won't go into here, between taking inspiration from the game itself or the genre that it pioneered. And Tarkov is a fascinating one, because Tarkov has problems. Tarkov has a lot of problems, especially in like the inventory management space. It's a fucking mess. It's overwhelming. I think it's a miserable experience personally, where you spend more than 50% of your game time fucking around in your inventory. It should be quicker and punchier. Now, again, some games in this space have addressed that to different degrees. Arc Raiders is probably the best one so far. It's still got a fiddliness and a complexity to it, but it's probably the best attempt. Duckov kind of inherits a bit of the fiddliness, like, to say that, again, it's less that it's drawn inspiration from extraction shooter fundamentals and more it's copied what Tarkov did before. And while, yes, it's noticeable in the inventory management, it's definitely noticeable in the quest design. The absolute weakest part of Tarkov easily is the quests and mission just delivery system. It needs an overhaul, it needs a work, and I'm not trying to attack Tarkov, but I am pointing out, as great as it is that it pioneered a genre, it still missed the mark in certain areas, and the missions and all that are just mind-numbingly boring. Walls of text, go fetch something, whatever, and it only is the most hardcore of sweaty person that's already invested in the game that really gets into the lore and the world crafting and building of Tarkov. It is just delivered so dryly and poorly that it's kind of weak, which is tragic, because the missions should be something that really make you think forward and carrot you on a stick. And Duckov actually inherits that as well, right? To the point where it's just walls of text of nothing missions that you're clicking through just to get from point A to point B. The loop itself is really fun, rolling around, shooting, that sort of stuff. You can hotbar all your health and that sort of thing. So like all the fundamentals are there. You can customize your character. I made an obnoxious, huge, warped head dude, but then I reset him to default because it just looked weird. I couldn't get over it. But yeah, look, it's tough, it's fun. There are some Metroidvania aspects to the map of like looping back around and unlocking shortcuts, teleporters, sewage lids, different extracts. There's a marking system that's not really good as far as like pinning items that you want to find specifically in Raid. And I'm not trying to make this a pissing match between this and Arc Raiders, but that's what's on my table right now, and they're both the same sort of genre. But I guess my main takeaway is this isn't super expensive. It is sort of cutesy and strange humor from a culture that's new to the space relatively. But as far as like a single player extraction shooter type game that is solid all round, apart from inheriting the Tarkov isms that still need work in the genre, and of course being, you know, a single player on ramp that's way more forgiving than most in this genre, you can't really go wrong with this game. And it's worth picking up even at full price because it's already that cheap as is. Anyway, I don't want to waffle much more. Escape from Duckov. It's pretty cool. I like it. I do. I kind of wish it did more of its own thing than just copying Tarkov warts and all. But at the same time, if this is what people want and are enjoying it, then who am I to begrudge that? Anyway, team, might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.